for the introduction. Thank you, Peter Harris, for inviting me to participate in these proceedings, and my apologies in advance to my fellow speakers for not being able to stay for all of their presentations, but because Hobart is the only capital which does not have direct flights from Canberra, the scheduling must be advised by the same people who advise the AFL on the composition of their competition. I have to leave early in order to get home to meet commitments that I have this evening and tomorrow. So I am hopefully talking, with the slides
very shortly,
about impediments to achieving faster growth in Australia's economy and greater prosperity through improving productivity. And that, I hope, is something that will set the scene for the rest of today's conversation. I listed 5 impediments to improving productivity, and I'll run through each of those, and hopefully by the time I finish doing that, my slides will be up on the computer. The first of those was politics. The political environment which would-be reformers have to contend with and make their arguments. The second is the potentially deteriorating quality of human capital, which I think important given the widespread acceptance that improvements in productivity going forward, especially in those sectors of the economy that have, for various reasons, been largely exempt from the processes of reform that dominated the 1980s and 1990s, really do require improvements in and better use of human capital in order to realise the potential for increased productivity that exists. The third impediment that I want to identify and talk about is what I call manufacturing fetishism. The widespread belief that's not unique to Australia by any means, but spreads across the political spectrum, that there's something inherently more worthy or noble about jobs in manufacturing than about the provision of services, which are too readily derided as consisting of flipping hamburgers and taking in each other's washing. And I want to show that the pursuit of manufacturing activity and employment as objectives in their own right, which seems to now have something approaching bipartisan support, will detract from efforts to lift the productivity of Australia as a whole. In the same vein, I think a fourth impediment to improving Australia's productivity performance is the romanticisation of small business. The belief that has always been part of the coalition's core political agenda, but now seems also to be supported by most of the rest of the political spectrum, that there is something intrinsically more noble or worthy about running a small business than there is about working in a big one, or for that matter, in a government. And in my view, the pursuit of that agenda, as we're now seeing, is also likely to be inimical to improving Australia's productivity and performance. And then finally, in something that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of you who know me or my work well, there is a trade-off, in my view, between the pursuit of productivity and the pursuit of security in all of its forms, and failing to appreciate that trade-off. Failing to recognise and understand that the pursuit of security has costs, including in terms of productivity, will also over time detract from our efforts to improve national well-being by pursuing productivity growth. I think it's very difficult, it will be very difficult for bodies like the Productivity Commission, which have as part of their raison d'etre, part of their modus operandi, the accumulation and presentation of evidence, or facts, that can be used by reforming governments to articulate the case for reform, and subsequently for monitoring and evaluating the success or otherwise of reform efforts, to do so in the kind of political environment that's now emerging across the world. For most of the reform era, public debate has been constructed on the perhaps unspoken premise that people are entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Evidence-based policy advocates have long accepted the principle that the second President of the United States, John Adams, set out about facts. The context in which he made that quote was defending, as a lawyer, a number of British officers who had been falsely accused of shooting at and killing some patriotic Americans who'd refused to pay taxes or thrown tea in Boston Harbour or whatever particularly patriotic act that it was at the time. And John Adams' point was that no matter how much you might feel passionately about a particular thing, you shouldn't allow that to be uninfluenced by facts or evidence. However, that's not the political world in which we now live. We live in what's become known as a post-truth world, which the Oxford English Dictionary, in specifying this year's word of the year, has said one in which facts are less influential than emotions or opinions in shaping what people believe. I'd never heard of Scotty Nell Hughes until a couple of weeks ago, but this quote from her as a leading CNN commentator and supporter of Donald Trump during the presidential election campaign seems to encapsulate the way in which the American political system now works. And you don't have to be too plugged into the Australian political scene to see that there are significant elements of that emerging here. If you don't believe it, then I commend you a reading of Malcolm Roberts's appendix to the thesis he wrote about climate change, which includes all sorts of fascinating observations about the way the world's international monetary system and central banks, for example, work. Or there's who I sometimes refer to as the odious Mr. Gove, who says famously that people in that country have had enough of experts. And while that encapsulated a sentiment that was heightened during the Brexit debate, again, it's been bubbling away and increasing in relevance in this country as well. It calls to my mind, for example, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, when as opposition leader, being informed that a majority of Australian economists thought that the best way of dealing with carbon emissions was to put a price on carbon, replied that that said more about the quality of Australian economists than it did about the merits of the proposal. Again, in this post-truth world, this rejection of ideas simply because they come from people who have a legitimate claim to know what they're talking about is going to make the pursuit of fact-based, productivity-enhancing economic and social reforms much more difficult to achieve than it was in the era of the 1980s and 1990s. From one perspective, it doesn't help that there isn't a burning platform, a sense of crisis, to embolden reformers and make people perhaps more receptive to the need for changes than they would be in a crisis environment. But as the Productivity Commission points out in the discussion paper, that's not the sort of circumstances that we should be wishing for in order to make the reform agenda more possible. It ought to be the case that the facts speak for themselves, with a bit of help from people who want to see widespread improvements in people's standards of living. But as I say, I think one of the chief impediments to achieving those objectives in the current environment is the nature of the political environment with which we now have to contend. My second point was around the possible deterioration in the quality of Australian human capital. There's no doubt that more Australians are getting more education. A higher proportion of the workforce has some kind of post-secondary qualification. Conversely, a diminishing proportion of the Australian workforce has nothing beyond year 10 of high school. And in principle, an increase in the quantity of education possessed by the workforce is a good thing. It ought to be conducive to higher levels of productivity. But there's been a lot of evidence, particularly coming out of the OECD over the last 15 or so years, suggesting that the quality of education, however difficult that is to measure, matters more for the stock of human capital than the quantity of it that members of the workforce may have received. And the evidence on the quality of Australian education is far less encouraging than that on the quantity of education that Australians have received. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen both TIMS and PISA surveys pointing to a decline not only in Australia's students' performance relative to other OECD countries, but perhaps more disturbingly in absolute terms. And more detailed evidence from the PISA survey in particular says that one significant reason for that decline in our overall average level is a decline in the proportion of our students who are above average and a significant increase in the proportion of our students who are well below the average or even minimum standards. Now, the solution to that is not, as Simon Birmingham repeatedly emphasises, and I agree with him, spending more on education. Rather, it is spending what we spend in a different way, more efficiently in some cases, more equitably in others. But given, as I said in my padded out introduction, the importance of human capital to lifting productivity in those areas where, as the Commission's discussion paper notes, the greatest potential in theory at least seems to exist. The fact that measures of the quality of our human capital may be on the decline is another significant impediment to achieving lasting change, and may also, of course, be playing into the first of the impediments that I've just spent discussing. The third impediment I mentioned was what I described as manufacturing fetishism, the belief that there's something inherently more worthy about manufacturing as an economic activity or a source of employment than anything else. A point that a surprisingly large proportion of our political class and many others have trouble grasping is that the sum of the different sectors' shares of GDP cannot exceed 100%. If you're going to have a bigger than average mining sector, as Australia's bound to have given our factor endowment, it's a matter of mathematics, not economics, that some other sectors have to be smaller as a share of GDP than they are in other countries with comparable standards of living. Given that Australia as a high-income country is likely to want to spend around 70% of our income on services, and given that most services are inherently non-tradable, even though the internet is changing the definition of non-tradable services a bit at the margin, it again is a matter of mathematics rather than economics that the manufacturing sector is bound to be one of the sectors that's smaller as a proportion of GDP in Australia, given that we have not only a much bigger mining sector than most other high-income countries, but also, and partly related to that, a bigger construction sector than most other countries. And seeking to fly in the face of that logic, as so many people of all sorts of political persuasions seem to want to do, is not only mathematically illogical, but leading us into, I think, some very misguided and ill-advised economic policies. Insofar as you can measure it, manufacturing is not a high labour productivity activity in Australia. Now, you can't tell that from the indexes of labour productivity that are published by the Stats Bureau, because consistent with international statistical norms, they are published as indexes based in the same base year as the annual national accounts, which means you can't compare labour productivity across industries at any point in time, or for that matter, across geographies. What I've done for a long time is to create alternative measures of labour productivity by dividing the best measures we have of hours worked by industry or geography into the published measures of gross value added to give you dollar figures for labour productivity that can then be used to make comparisons across geographies or industries rather than simply over time as the published indices put out by the ABS allow you to do. And what that shows is that there are 6 industries in Australia whose productivity is above that of the economy as a whole, and they are the ones that intuition would lead you to expect to find in that category. I know that the data I've used has its flaws, and there have been some intelligent criticisms of the way I put this together. But I don't think those criticisms seriously invalidate the ranking that I've shown there. What that chart sheerly illustrates is that to the extent that governments succeed in increasing manufacturing as a share of GDP, which they seem to want to do, or to reverse the otherwise inexorable decline in manufacturing as a share of GDP, aggregate productivity is going to be low. And it's going to be even lower to the extent that politicians succeed in increasing manufacturing in South Australia at the expense of other states, given that manufacturing productivity in South Australia is below the average for manufacturing as a whole. Part of the reason for Australia's poor manufacturing productivity is that we have an above average proportion of our firms managed by below average managers by comparison with the United States. And that in turn is why manufacturing productivity in Australia as a proportion of US productivity is, according to a study that's now a decade old but I doubt has changed by Treasury much, is the third lowest of all of the sectors that are identified in the EU CLEMS database from which this series was compiled. And there's possibly a reason for that too, in the sense that, again, as the Productivity Commission discussion paper notes in passing, Australia's manufacturing sector has a higher proportion of small businesses in it than many others. And this leads me to the second last point about impediments to improving productivity, which is the romanticisation of small business. I said before, it's coalition ideology that there's something inherently more noble about running a small business than working for a big one. And that's apparently why the coalition government is preferencing small business when it comes to company tax. What's perhaps more surprising is that that's become tripartisan. The Labor Party and the Greens are opposed to cutting the company tax rate in general, but they support cutting it for small businesses, apparently out of a belief that it will help promote jobs and innovation. The ABS industry survey shows that, as small business advocates often quote, small business accounts for 44% of total private sector employment, although the footnotes in that survey tell you that private sector excludes the banks, who are of course big employers. But as that chart shows, despite accounting for 44% of total employment, small businesses have generated just 5% of the increase in total employment over the last 5 years, whereas businesses with more than 200 employees, who account for about 30% of total employment, have generated more than 2/3 of the increase in employment. Likewise, the figures show that small businesses are far less likely to engage in any of the four forms of innovation than larger businesses. So the belief that preferentially taxing small business will do anything to boost jobs and growth or innovation has no more evidence for it than the Immaculate Conception. And yet that seems to be an article of faith for all of our three parties. The last point I want to make is that Australia has consistently got wrong the trade-off between security and productivity. This is a little bit flippant, but budget papers are meant to be a statement of our national priority. So it's interesting that over the last 12 years of budget papers number one, productivity has had about 200 fewer mentions than security, and has been mentioned more often than security in only 3 budget paper number ones, which happen to be the 3 in which statement number 4 was devoted to a productivity-related theme. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that security isn't important. Of course it is, in reality, and for politicians. We can't not have security. What my argument is that the pursuit of security without thinking about the probability of the risks that we're seeking to eliminate, without trying to specify the probability to which we are trying to reduce whatever risks we're concerned about, without considering the cost of getting to that lower level of risk or the benefit of getting lower level of risk, is taking its toll in terms of productivity. I've thought for a number of years that the best way that anyone who wants a tax break, a subsidy, protection from competition, or anything like that, knowing that their proposal will not stand the sort of scrutiny that the Productivity Commission gives it, is to wrap it in a security blanket, to make it a matter not simply of national security, but biosecurity, water security, food security, energy security. As soon as someone mentions the word security, we are supposed to turn our brains off, to suspend our critical faculties, and never to mention such grubby concepts as cost and benefit. Someone far more influential than I put this very well in a speech that he gave a couple of years ago before he became the governor of the Reserve Bank, emphasising, perhaps even more so in an ageing society, that our inability to calibrate, and indeed sometimes even to think about, the trade-offs between security or risk mitigation and productivity will threaten our ability to improve our standard of living over time through gains in productivity, without actually necessarily doing a great deal to reduce the risks that we're ostensibly concerned about. So 5 obstacles to the goal which the Productivity Commission is setting for itself and with which it's been tasked by the government: political environment, the deterioration in human capital, manufacturing fetishism, the false romanticisation of small business, and our inability to think seriously and sensibly, indeed in some cases to think at all, about the trade-offs between security and productivity. Thank you very much.